Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are cracking open a really critical field of pharmacology, anti-Parkinsonism agents.
Mm-hmm.
We're going straight to the source, distilling the insights from the authoritative focus on nursing pharmacology, 8th edition.
Right.
Our mission today is to understand the chemical imbalance at the very heart of Parkinson disease, and more importantly, the ingenious drug strategies we use to fight it. You know, when you hear Parkinson disease, the first image that comes to mind is often just a tremor, but it's so much more devastating.
It really is.
We're talking about a progressive neurological disorder, a fundamental loss of motor control. It affects posture, gait, and it leads to what's clinically known as bradykinesia.
That extreme sluggishness.
Exactly, that debilitating difficulty in just starting or stopping movement. I mean, you think of figures like Muhammad Ali or Michael J. Fox diagnosed so young, and it just highlights how relentless this is.
And to treat it, you absolutely have to remember that Parkinson's is, at its core, a chemistry problem. It's a signaling failure deep inside the brain's basal ganglia.
Well-
If you can just grasp that imbalance, the whole treatment plan suddenly becomes perfectly logical.
Okay, so let's unpack that. We talk about an imbalance, but what exactly is missing? And what's sort of taking over?
Well, the symptoms are rooted in the degeneration of dopamine-producing neurons, specifically in an area called the substantia nigra.
Right.
Dopamine is a crucial inhibitory neurotransmitter. So when those neurons die off, they can't send enough dopamine signals to another area, the corpus striatum.
So that's the too little part of the equation.
That's the too little. Now, contrast that with the second key player, acetylcholine, right? HA. And it's an excitatory neurotransmitter. So normally, dopamine and acetylcholine are in this really carefully calibrated
That's
balance.
to regulate movement.
Exactly, for smooth movement, muscle tone. But when that inhibitory dopamine just drops out of the picture, the excitatory cholinergic system effectively, well, it runs wild.
And that's what causes the rigidity, the tremors, the bradykinesia.
That's it. You've got it.
So if the problem is a lopsided scale, too little inhibitory dopamine, way too much excitatory acetylcholine, the goal is twofold. We either need to increase the first one or block the second one. It sounds straightforward, but there's a major hurdle right at the start, isn't there? Especially for the dopaminergics.
A huge hurdle.
Let's talk about that. The main event is getting dopamine back in. So agents like levodopa, why is it so difficult?
The critical biological challenge, and this is really the crux of the whole treatment puzzle, is the blood-brain barrier, the BBB.
Right.
Dopamine itself, the molecule, is just too large. It can't cross that barrier.
Yeah.
So if we just gave a person pure dopamine, it would all get metabolized in the periphery, cause some really severe side effects, and zero therapeutic benefit would ever reach the brain.
Here's where it gets really interesting then. If we can't just deliver the dopamine, we have to, sneak it past the border patrol? How do we do that?
We use a precursor. We use levodopa.
Okay.
Levodopa is a chemical precursor to dopamine, and crucially, it can cross the blood-brain barrier. Once it's safely inside the brain, enzymes there convert it into the dopamine we need. It is the absolute cornerstone of PD treatment.
But it's almost never given alone, is it? It's always in combination with carbidopa, the drug Sinemet.
That's right. Almost never alone.
Carbidopa seems like the sidekick here, but its role is, it's brilliant. Why is it so essential to pair them? Is it for safety, or does it improve efficacy?
It's both, actually. It's a fantastic mechanism. Carbidopa acts as a shield.
A shield.
Yeah. It inhibits an enzyme called dopa-decarboxylase, but, and this is the key, only in the periphery, outside the brain.
So it's protecting the levodopa before it gets where it needs to go.
Exactly. This enzyme's job is to break down levodopa. By blocking it, carbidopa ensures way more levodopa actually makes it across the barrier. This means we can use a much lower dose.
Which reduces those off-systemic side effects.
Precisely. You reduce the nausea, the cardiac issues, all the problems that come from too much dopamine floating around the body. They even have extended release versions now, like Ruitary, which helps a lot with dosing schedules.
That focus on peripheral metabolism brings us to one of the most vital clinical safety points in the source material. We're talking about the unsuspecting menace of vitamin B6.
Oh, this is a big one.
So a patient takes an over-the-counter vitamin with B6 pyridoxine, and it completely undermines this whole elegant system.
It does. Vitamin B6 actually speeds up that conversion of levodopa to dopamine peripherally, right where carbidopa is trying to protect it.
So the PD symptoms come roaring back.
They come back fast
I
as
see.
less drug reaches the brain. And you get an increase in those dangerous systemic effects like palpitations. It's why counseling on all supplements is so critical.
That is such a life-changing piece of teaching. And speaking of safety, what about contraindications for this whole class?
Well, you have to avoid them in angle closure glaucoma, which can be exacerbated.
Hmm.
And you must screen patients for suspicious skin lesions because levodopa has, unfortunately, been associated with the development of melanoma.
And the adverse effects are still a challenge, even with carbidopa.
Oh, yes. Because of that systemic dopamine stimulation, you have to watch out for psychological effects like anxiety and confusion, cardiac issues, arrhythmias, orthostatic hypotension.
And to GI problems too, nausea, anorexia.
Right. And you can even see some less common but really strange things like bizarre breathing patterns.
So levodopa and carbidopa are the foundation, but there are other players in this family, right? Like for when swallowing is an issue.
Yes, absolutely. You've got subcutaneous epimorphine for sort of rescue situations, and rhodogatine, which is a transdermal patch. Incredibly useful when a patient's ability to swallow is compromised.
Okay, so that's phase one, boost the dopamine. What about phase two? Shifting our focus to the other side of that imbalance, blocking the hyperactive acetylcholine.
The anticholinergics.
Let's move to those. The anticholinergic agents, drugs like benztropine or trihexyphenidyl.
So these are our type 2 drugs. Their main action is just to block the stimulating effects of acetylcholine in the CNS, trying to restore that crucial balance.
And where do they fit in therapeutically?
They're often effective in the early stages of PD, sometimes used as adjunctive therapy, or very frequently to treat drug-induced Parkinsonism, the extrapyramidal symptoms caused by other meds.
The catch, though, is that they don't just work in the brain. They also block acetylcholine receptors everywhere else.
Exactly. They block the peripheral nervous system, which is controlled by the parasympathetic system. And when you suppress the rest and digest system, you get predictable and sometimes dangerous side effects.
We all learned the mnemonic, right? Can't see, can't spit, can't pee, can't... Well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that translates clinically to blurred vision and photophobia, a really dry mouth, constipation from decreased GI motility, and urinary retention.
But the most alarming one, to me, for safety, is the blockage of sweating.
Yes.
I mean, if a patient on these drugs travels somewhere hot or is just outside on a summer day, that reduced ability to sweat can quickly lead to flushing and a dangerously high risk of heat prostration.
That has to be top-line patient teaching, no question.
Absolutely.
And those peripheral effects really dictate the contraindications. We have to avoid these drugs in narrow-angle glaucoma, any kind of GI or GU obstruction, conditions like prostatic hypertrophy.
Where urinary retention is already a huge risk.
Right. And myasthenia gravis, where blocking neuromuscular acetylcholine receptors is the last thing you want to do.
Okay, that brings us to the final class, the adjunctive agents. These are the ones typically reserved for when that carbidopa-levodopa response starts to wear off or fluctuate.
Right, which is a common phenomenon as the disease progresses. We have two main mechanisms here. First are the COMT inhibitors, like entacapone and tolcapone.
COMT.
Catecholamineone O-methyltransferase. It's another enzyme that degrades dopamine. So by blocking it, these drugs essentially lengthen the plasma concentration and duration of levodopa. They stretch out its efficacy.
And entacapone is so useful, it's even in a fixed combination tablet, Stalevo.
It is. However, and this is a huge safety warning, we have to talk about tolcapone.
The liver damage.
Yes, it's associated with fulminant and potentially fatal liver damage. Because of that risk, it's contraindicated in liver disease and is really only reserved for later stages when other drugs are failing.
A serious warning. Okay, so what's the second adjunctive mechanism?
That would be the MAOB inhibitors, drugs like rasagiline and selegiline. These inhibit monoamine oxidase type B, which is an enzyme concentrated in the CNS that breaks down dopamine right at the synapse.
And with any MAOI, there are strict safety protocols.
Essential. You have to avoid all other MAOIs for at least 14 days before starting dopaminergic to prevent a catastrophic hypertensive crisis.
And that's not all, right? There are dietary restrictions.
For agents like rasagiline, yes. Strict dietary adherence. Patients must avoid tyramine-containing foods. So aged cheeses, cured meats, certain beers, and specific drugs like St. John's wort and some analgesics.
Which brings us to the so what, the practical application for you, the learner. Given all this complexity, the risk profiles, what are the absolute mandatory monitoring responsibilities?
You really have to synthesize your assessment across multiple systems. You must monitor CNS status orientation, gait, reflexes. Cardiovascular stability is paramount. BP, pulse, especially for orthostatic drops, watching for arrhythmias.
And you can't forget the GI and GU systems.
Never. You've got to track bowel function vigilantly for constipation or even paralytic ileus, and bladder function for any sign of urinary retention. And of course, liver, renal, and CBC labs have to be monitored regularly.
Okay, and for implementation, safety requires active intervention, not just watching.
Exactly. Because of that orthostatic hypotension risk, you have to teach patients to change positions slowly. If constipation is an issue, we need to institute a bowel program, not just wait.
For urinary retention, you can have the patient try to void right before taking their dose.
That's a great tip. And if GI upset is an issue, giving the med with meals can help, though you always have to consider how that affects absorption timing.
And back to those anticholinergics, frequent oral care, sugarless lozenges for the dry mouth, and clear instruction on hydration and avoiding hot weather because of that heat prostration risk.
And a quick note on lifespan. While PD is rare in kids, if you need a drug, diphenhydramine is often the choice. But for older adults, our primary demographic, the risk just skyrockets.
Everything gets magnified.
Everything. Both dopaminergic and anticholinergic drugs can aggravate pre-existing conditions. Glaucoma, BPH, cardiac instability. They need intensive monitoring, frequent dosage adjustments, and maybe most importantly, incredibly detailed written drug teaching protocols. The regimens are just too involved.
That recap on patient teaching is so vital. Let's hit those non-negotiables one last time. Avoid over-the-counter vitamins. That B6 interaction is non-negotiable unless the prescriber says it's okay.
Oh, check.
Women of childbearing age need barrier contraception. And always, always make sure the patient has clear written instructions for their medication schedule.
The bottom line is, PD therapy is a chemical tightrope walk. You're constantly rebalancing the inhibitory dopamine and the excitatory acetylcholine.
Right.
And we attack this with a three-pronged strategy. Dopaminergics for replacement, anticholinergics to block the hyperactivity, and adjuncts to make the main drugs last as long as possible.
And understanding that fundamental imbalance really is the shortcut to mastering the entire plan. If you know those two forces, dopamine loss and acetylcholine dominance, you know why every single drug in that regimen exists. So what does this all mean for the patient, long term? The challenge remains. These drugs only manage symptoms. The neural degeneration, it continues until there's just no therapeutic response.
And that progression leads to a crucial clinical challenge that touches every single discipline. As PD advances, difficulty swallowing dysphagia often leads to aspiration pneumonia. It's a major complication.
So it raises an important question.
It does. Even as our pharmacology is restoring movement, how does the multidisciplinary team, the speech pathologists, the nurses, the doctors, how do we integrate these complex drug protocols with physical and behavioral therapies to maintain function and safety, when the very act of administering the oral medication becomes a hazard itself?
A vital consideration for anyone caring for these patients. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into anti-Parkinsonism agents.